Welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon on bridging the gap between ISO 9001 and AS9100. And then we also have a couple slides at the end of today's presentation regarding information security services that we thought you might want to take a look at. So to get started, just a couple notes on introductions and housekeeping. My name is Scott McDonough. I'm the Director of Sales and Global Marketing with the Smithers Quality Assessments Division. You'll notice that chat has been disabled. Please use the Q&A button to submit your questions to be answered after the presentation. We have set aside some time, so if you do have questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A button to ask, and we will do our best to answer all of your questions at the end. When you exit the webinar today, a brief survey will appear. We would certainly appreciate your feedback, as it does help inform future webinars that we bring you. So our guest speakers today, we have two Aarons on deck today. Aaron Dalby is our Aerospace Sector Manager with the Quality Assessments Division of Smithers, and Aaron Troshenitz, who is our General Manager for North America Quality Assessments Division. So with that quick intro, Aaron, I will hand it over to you to begin your presentation.
All right, thank you, Scott. And I will start my screen share here shortly. So I've just started sharing. I just want to confirm, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, excellent. Well, I just want to start off by thanking you for attending this webinar. I certainly look forward to this presentation. So I want to start off with an introduction of myself and my background. So my name is Aaron Dalby. I'm the new manager of the Aerospace Sector at Smithers SQA. I've worked in the aerospace industry for 20 years, 10 years in the manufacturing industry in methods engineering and quality management roles, all for tier 1 suppliers. And then 10 years as a third-party lead auditor for one of the largest CVs in North America. So I look forward to reviewing our subject matter, and as well as the opportunities to continue discussions as we look to grow our business relationships with you. Our mission at Smithers SQA in the aerospace sector and all of our sectors is to ensure we provide accurate data on time with high touch to our clients. So again, thank you, and I'll move on to my presentation. Starting off with the agenda, of course, we just did the introduction. The next thing we'll talk about is the benefits of upgrading from ISO 9001 to AS9100, and then we'll review some of our ISO 9001 2015 requirements and their application to AS9100 2016. We'll talk about the gaps that are needing to be addressed for upgrade to AS9100 2016, focusing on clauses 4 through 10. After that, there is the ISS presentation that Scott mentioned, and we'll proceed to final questions after that. So, benefits of upgrading from ISO 9001 2015 to AS9100 2016, or we're calling it AS9100D. Number one, it does improve your ability to satisfy aerospace customer requirements. Secondly, if implemented appropriately for your organization, it improves efficiency and profitability, for instance, by reducing your cost of quality. Thirdly, and this is related to that first bullet, it does provide additional opportunities to bid on and win new aerospace work, as many of the aerospace customers in the industry require certification to AS9100D or 9100 2016. I should also mention that 9100 2016 includes industry best practices, including additional clarification for risk-based thinking. So I do encourage you to download a copy of the AS9100D standard, and it is located at the link that I've shown below at sae.org. So looking at the ISO 9001 requirements and their application to AS9100. So when we look at the AS9100 standard, it does include all of the requirements from ISO 9001 2015. And then it specifies the additional 9100 2016 requirements in bold and italic text. So that's where we can see the difference between the ISO requirements and the add-on requirements from 9100 2016. The next thing I want to bring up is section 0.3. This defines the process approach, and it is foundational for implementation of AS9100 2016, similar to ISO 9001, as it relates to clause 4.4.1 requirements and for supporting third-party audits per AS9101F. Now, AS9101F is the document that aerospace auditors utilize to execute the AQMS audits. So all the forms within AS9101F are the reporting forms, and they're actually located in our OASIS database system. It's an online aerospace supplier information system that communicates the results of all audits for aerospace. So I do want to mention, though, if the process approach in section 0.3 is not utilized to identify your organization macro processes or high-level processes, there will be gaps identified when third-party auditors are evaluating your AQMS using those AS9101F forms to determine process performance. So the next thing I want to mention is in relation to the vocabulary for the standard. Of course, the reference to ISO 9001 2015 vocabulary still exists, but there are some new key terms. For instance, counterfeit parts, which are added to the standard because of the risk in aerospace industry, product safety, which has to do with ensuring that the parts that are being manufactured do not provide or cause harm to the persons using them or damage to those parts that are being installed in. Then there's some new terms related to contracts and products, for instance, special requirements, critical items, and key characteristics. Those will show up as we go through each of those clauses 4 through 10. So just a brief summation of the additional requirements for AS9100 when we compare to ISO 9001 2015. You can see here that 4 of these definitions are identified specifically in this summation, being counterfeit parts, product safety, special requirements, and critical items. They show up specifically in some of the changes and updates to ISO 9001 2015. In addition to that, there's a focus on on-time delivery to our customers. There's a focus on adding requirements for configuration management of your products and services. There's a focus on now operational risk management, and this is in addition to the risk that we see in clause 6.1. It's added within clause 8 for operational risk. And then finally, there are additional requirements within production and control of our external providers. So let's talk about the gaps that we need to address within the clauses 4 through 10, starting with clause 4. And just as a note, these clauses 4 through 10 are the clauses that the third-party auditors will be auditing your organization against. Excuse me. So first thing is, there is an added requirement in clause 4.4.1 for the aerospace quality management system to address applicable customer and statutory and regulatory requirements. For instance, things like ITAR would be included in that as required based on your customer flow down. Secondly, there is a firm requirement for documented information maintained with content accurately defined in clause 4.4.2. I know in ISO 9001, there is not clear or specific requirements for documented information. Here in the AS9100 standard, there is. I should note that there is still no specific requirement for a quality manual similar to ISO 9001, but a quality manual can be utilized to prevent gaps within clause 4.4.2 and the required documented information. Okay, moving on to clause 5 additions. So in clause 5.1.2, there is a customer focus requirement that has been added. And this is under the leadership responsibility of the standard. This is to ensure that the leadership understands the requirement to measure customer on-time delivery and product and service conformity performance. And during an audit, there certainly will be a gap identified if there are no actions being taken for targets that are not met or will not be met in clause 5.1.2. Again, we need to ensure that customer focus by taking action to address those gaps. In clause 5.3, a requirement has been added for a specific member of your organization's management to be identified as the management representative. So we have a specific role identified now in the AS9100 2016 standard with defined responsibilities in clause 5.3. Moving on to clause 6, there are actually no additions or updates to ISO 9001 2015 for upgrading to AS9100, but I do want to point out clause 6.3, planning of changes. This is a foundational clause when implementing and maintaining an aerospace quality management system. And I should note, if not utilized effectively, including for managing the upgrade from ISO 9001 2015 to AS9100 2016, there will be gaps identified during third-party audits. So I really encourage you to utilize the requirements of this clause when planning for implementation of your aerospace quality management system. Clause 7, the additions that we're seeing here start off in clause 7.152. And here's where there's additional or increased requirements for measurement traceability, or in industry often called calibration requirements. So there's specific requirements for a calibration register or calibration list that have been added, and defined environmental conditions for calibration activities if you're performing those calibrations in-house. And there will be gaps identified during third-party audits if not adequately addressed, especially as it relates to ensure product conformance and product safety for aerospace customers. Now, this is again listed in here because of the risk within the aerospace industry. Next point here, there's an update in relation to clause 7.3. Awareness requirements for personnel have been enhanced, including with those key definitions of product safety and ethical behavior. And then lastly, in section 7, there are updates related to documented information requirements, which were enhanced in clause 7.5.3.2. Firstly, to prevent use of any obsolete documented information. So adequate controls need to be put in place for that. And then secondly, to implement data protection processes when we use documented information that is managed electronically. And I have a note here at the end. There's more on this at the end of the webinar when Aaron Troshines talks about ISS later on. All right, moving on to clause 8. Now there are 7 sections within clause 8, so I'm going to address each of these separately. So looking at clause 8.1, we see a strengthened planning and control activity that's defined with specific arrangements in clause 8.1. Some organizations would call this project management, but there, even in addition to that, there's additional planning and control activities defined here. There's also increased focus on meeting on-time delivery requirements as part of our resource determination. Going back to our summation of what the additions are, this is the focus again on meeting on-time delivery, similarly to what we saw in clause 5 for customer focus. Secondly, here, there are requirements defined for project management, as I just mentioned, and work transfer in clause 8.1, including managing with acceptable risk. So we need to define what risk is acceptable to the organization. Thirdly, there is a clause specific to operational risk management, and here's where it dives into the requirements for how that is to be managed. This is a key process addition that can be applied to all clause 8 processes, but is a specific requirement of AS9100 2016 as part of clause 8.2 contract review and as part of clause 8.4 external provision and use or selection of external providers. And then lastly, in 8.1, the configuration management process in clause 8.1.2 is another key process addition that needs to be implemented to ensure identification and control of the product or service is to be consistent with the documented information that controls it. So there needs to be that ongoing check at any point to ensure that product or service is consistent with the controlling documented information. And this is throughout the product life cycle, including during design changes in clause 8.3.6. And now 8.3.6 happens to be the control of design and development changes. So to continue on with 8.1, product safety in clause 8.1.3 is another key process addition that applies throughout the entire product lifecycle to ensure the product provided to the customer can perform its intended purpose without causing harm to persons or damage to property. So this is a key definition that now has specific requirement in our operations processes. Operations being clause 8. Now, next bullet there is related to counterfeit parts. And this is added again because of the risk to the aerospace industry. And this is defined as a key process in 8.1.4 and needs to be implemented to prevent use of any counterfeit or even suspect counterfeit parts or materials. And this is an added control that's implemented and defined in our clauses, as we'll see later on in clause 8.4 in externally provided processes, products, and services. Moving on to clause 8.2. 8.2 is focused on reviewing information provided by the customer, contract review activities, sales processes, falls under 8.2. So the changes that we see here, number one, implementation is needed for determining special requirements per clause 8.2.2. This is a new term and the definitions are defined in clause 3, as I mentioned before. So these special requirements are determined by the customer or the organization based on having a high risk of meeting those requirements when determining requirements for products and services to be offered for those customers. So that's part of your communication activities, is determining those special requirements for your customer. Secondly, there's a requirement added to clause 8.2.2 to identify operational risk. There's a direct communication back to that risk as defined within the addition in 8.1 when determining requirements for products and services to be offered for those customers. And I added a note here that a gap will be identified in third-party audits if identified risks are not mitigated and accepted prior to committing to supply products or services to the customer. So we need to make sure that review is considered and risks mitigated prior to signing on the dotted line of those contracts. And then thirdly here, there's a requirement added to clause 8.2.3 for coordinating review of requirements with applicable functions in the organization and for negotiating mutual acceptable requirements with the customer when some requirements cannot be met. So this ensures that we have the appropriate technical ability for accepting those requirements that are being flowed down by the customer, as well as being able to define communications with our customer when we can't meet some of those requirements based on the input of those applicable functions. All right, let's move on to 8.3. This is our design and development process clause, and there are some changes throughout this process. So 8.3.2, design and development planning, there was an addition to define distinct activities for the design effort and additional consideration requirements for the product. 8.3.3, design and development inputs. There's a key addition here to consider potential consequences of obsolescence. We need to ensure that if there is a potential obsolete material, for instance, or fastener that's being used in a design, we need to consider that as part of our inputs. 8.3.4, design and development controls. There's an addition to require authorization to progress to next stage of design. So this needs to be something that is auditable. We need to be able to see that authorization to progress during third-party audits. And there's a requirement for your organization functions concerned with the design stage to be part of that design review. Again, providing that technical knowledge and input to those review phases. Next here, this is a new clause, 8.3.4.1, new requirement from AS9100 2016 for verification and validation testing. And it's added for appropriate testing controls, including the requirement to ensure we use calibrated equipment or monitoring and measuring devices during the test are controlled. In 8.3.5, we talk about design development outputs. And the addition here is related to our key terms that we mentioned before. Number one, we need to specify any critical items that have a significant impact on the product being manufactured and any key characteristics which have a significant effect on fit, form, or function and any related actions. Also here, there's a requirement for outputs to be given approval by the authorized personnel before release and define data that controls the product. In 8.3.6, I'm going to move my Zoom window around here so I can read this last clause. There was changes to how we control design development changes. There's an addition to require customer notification of changes that affect your customer's requirements. So this is part of that customer communication activity in clause 8.2, and requirements to control those changes per that new process in 8.1.2 configuration management. All right, moving on to clause 8.4. This is the process to control external provision, or many organizations call this purchasing or control of supply chain. So additions in 8.4.1 are general addition, and it includes updates for requirements for control of external provision, including specific organization responsibilities, requirements for use of customer designated and approved sources, which is quite common in the aerospace industry, requires management of risks with external provision, again, pointing back to requirements of clause 8.1, and explicit requirement added for external providers to provide appropriate controls to their external providers, both directly to your first tier suppliers and sub-tier suppliers, and required flow downs to support consistency throughout your supply chain. 8.4.1.1, there's new requirements added to define the process for managing supplier approval, specific requirements for your register of external providers, requirements for reviewing external provider performance and defining what actions will be taken when your external providers are not meeting those requirements. And lastly, there's requirements for defining external provider controls of documented information. So there's flow downs that we'll talk about in 8.4.3 when I get there in a couple of bullet points related to that documented information control. Clause 8.4.2 related to type and extent of control. There's updates, including a requirement to consider the results of the 8.4.1.1 review of your external provider performance to prevent risk of not meeting your on-time delivery and conformity requirements to your customer. Again, we have a customer focus here, even as it relates to how we manage our suppliers or external providers. There's a requirement for verification of externally provided processes, products, or services based on risk. It includes the risk of counterfeit parts. So this is a new term again, and it applies specifically to how we review and verify for counterfeit parts, for instance, during receiving inspection. There's requirements for recall when externally provided product is released pending completion of verification activities. Requirements for control of external provider delegations. This is when we delegate things like inspection to our external providers. There's an additional evaluation of data on test reports to confirm results comply with requirements. This ensures that our suppliers are accurately representing the data on those reports. And then in some cases, there's an added validation process to confirm the accuracy of the raw materials. For instance, raw material testing as a significant operational risk. And that points us to, again, our key term, critical items. Critical items often come with significant operational risk. Lastly, in clause 8.4.3, information for external providers. This was updated to include specific topics to be considered for communication of requirements to our external providers or suppliers, including specific identification of what relevant technical data applies to that request or purchase order, requirements to prevent use of counterfeit parts, again, key definition, requirements for external provider persons to be aware of their contribution to product safety. So these definitions are being flowed down throughout our supply chain and use of external providers. Okay, moving on to clause 8.5. This is our control of production and service provision clause. There is an addition here of requirements for specific controls to be applied, including when we use sampling plans for product acceptance for inspection, they need to be justified against some industry standard. There needs to be controls for accountability of the product, whether, for instance, non-conforming items. There needs to be controls for identified critical items and key characteristics. Again, key terms that we're using in the aerospace standard. Identification of in-process inspection and verification points, for instance, on your work orders. Provisions for removal of foreign object debris. Here's a new term, and FOD to prevent foreign object damage. For instance, metal chips from machining can often cause scratching or gouging of parts that are being manufactured. So there's a requirement to control that FOD, foreign object debris and foreign object damage. 8.5.1.1. Control of equipment, tools, and software programs. There's new requirements here that are added for validation and storage for those tools. There's new requirements in 8.5.1.2 for how we control our special processes. There's new requirements added for processes where the resulting output cannot be verified by subsequent monitoring or measurement. So some typical special processes would include things like non-destructive testing or inspection, anodizing, welding, heat treat. These are all examples for where these new requirements would apply. 8.5.1.3. This is a clause for production process verification. Often in industry, this is referred to the FAI process or first article inspection process. And there's new requirements added here to ensure the production processes can produce parts that meet requirements. And this FAI process may include customer flowdown relating or including the requirements of AS9100. This is a specific aerospace document that controls first article inspection or what we call production process verification. Continuing on with 8.5, there are some updates in 8.5.2, identification and traceability, with the addition of requirements for maintaining identification of products as part of clause 8.1.2. Again, configuration management is one of those key processes that we see throughout the update to 9100-2016. And it also defines requirements for control of acceptance authority media when used to accept the product. For instance, stamping with a number that represents a person or an inspector. Moving on to 8.5.3, there were no specific changes. 8.5.4, preservation of product. There is an addition of requirements for product preservation. And this includes removal of FOD, as I mentioned and talked about the definition earlier, as well as shelf life controls for time-sensitive products or products used in production or service provision that have an expiry. 8.5.5, post-delivery activities. there is an addition here that clarifies expectations for when problems occur after delivery and how the organization needs to take action to address those issues. There's a direct link here to clause 8.7, which we'll discuss, and how we control non-conforming product. 8.5.6, control of changes. There's an addition of requirement to identify the specific persons that are authorized to approve those changes. So for instance, if we have specific people authorized, perhaps they are the ones that are stamping those changes on the work orders. Moving on to clause 8.6, requirements are added to require documented information be maintained to provide evidence that products and services meet defined requirements. And I want to note that gaps identified in this area during third-party audits will generate a major nonconformance if probable delivery of nonconforming product is identified. So again, there's a customer focus here, and we want to ensure there is no potential to ship nonconforming product to our customers. Second bullet here, there is a requirement that's been added to ensure documented information that is required to accompany products is present at delivery or in shipping. And moving on to clause 8.7. This is our clause for control of non-conforming outputs. And there's an addition here that 8.7.1 requires documented information for your non-conformity control process, and that needs to be maintained. It includes additional provisions for disposition authority requirements, for containment, timely reporting to customers on nonconformances affecting delivered products or services, and requirements for corrective action within clause 10.2 for nonconformances detected after delivery. Also in 8.7.1, it requires a process for obtaining authorization for acceptance of nonconforming products or services by a relevant authority, for instance, the FAA, and by the customer. It also adds specific criteria for implementation of use as is and repair dispositions. For instance, as it relates to the customer or whoever is responsible for design. And then also this clause requires that is the product that is dispositioned as scrap to be identified, controlled, and then physically rendered unusable or destroyed. So scrap product cannot find its way back into the supply chain. And there's a supporting clause here in 8.7.1 related to counterfeit parts. Any counterfeit part that is suspect or that is confirmed counterfeit needs to be controlled to prevent re-entry into the supply chain. And directly related to the previous bullet, where if it is confirmed to be counterfeit, it needs to be rendered unusable or destroyed. Clause 9 additions. There's information here to be evaluated for customer satisfaction that is specifically defined in clause 9.1.2. Customer satisfaction requirements must review now product and service conformity, on-time delivery performance, customer complaints, and corrective action requests. And there will be a gap identified in your third-party audits if there's no improvement plans that are in place that address those deficiencies identified by your customer satisfaction evaluations. Management review inputs and outputs have changed. So inputs require on-time delivery performance in clause 9.3.2, and outputs require identifications of risk in clause 9.3.3, based on review of those defined inputs. And I should note that in addition to planning of changes in clause 6.3, that 9.2 internal audits, 9.3 management review, and 10.2 corrective action are also foundational clauses to the aerospace quality management system. So lastly here in clause 10, I have 4 bullets to discuss with you. The corrective action process requires a root cause determination now to include the review of human factors in clause 10.2.1. This is to prevent recurrence of nonconformities that are caused by those human factors. And those human factors can be found in clause 7.1.4, or and there is a best practice for this from the FAA called the Dirty Dozen, and this can be found on the FAA website as noted here. In the corrective action process in clause 10.2.1, it also requires flow down to suppliers when they are determined to be responsible for the root cause, and requires defined actions when corrective actions are untimely or not effective. So this corrective action process supports the performance requirements from 8.4 as it relates to flowing down those corrective action. 10.2.1 also requires a documented information to document. Some organizations call it a procedure, but it's required to describe the process for nonconformity and corrective action, similar to the requirement 8.7 for control of nonconforming outputs. And then lastly, 10.3 is our continual improvement clause, and there's an addition required here to evaluate the effectiveness of the results of the improvement activities that have taken place. So with that, I will pass this on to Aaron Troshnetz for the ISS section. So thank you for listening to the upgrade portion of the webinar.
Excellent. Thank you, Aaron. And thank you everyone for joining us during this webinar. I know we've carried a lot of material with Aaron so far, so I'll try to make my section brief. Aaron, if you're able to go to the next slide, please. So a little bit of background on myself. I have 10 years in manufacturing, various progressive roles within specifically operations, quality, and program management. Most of my industry experience is in heavy truck, with some interface with automotive, on-road type applications as well. I've worked now in the certification end of things for about 10 years, supporting various programs, automotive, aerospace, environmental, medical device, occupational health and safety, and most recently, and what we'll talk about today, is cybersecurity, with various degrees of lead auditor trainings, implementation trainings on all those various programs. So certainly had my hands in quite a few different programs from a standard standpoint. In addition to that, I'm also a certified quality manager, organizational excellence, CMQ OE, as well as a certified quality auditor, CQA, Lean, Six Sigma, and project manager professional, PMP, trained in various disciplines. So that's a little bit of background on myself. Like I said, I do want to spend a little time talking about information security services. So Aaron, if you can go to the next slide. So we are very excited to be offering cybersecurity audit and assessment services, what we refer to as our information security services line of offerings. And really what this starts with is what we characterize as tailored assessment services. So this is specifically a phased approach. We work with each of the clients we work with through a phased hands-on approach to tailor requirements so that organizations can maximize the value through our engagement with them. There is no project or no assessment we do with client, at least from the standpoint of these tailored services, that are quite exactly the same. Everyone's unique into each of the various client requirements. Some of the programs that they include at this time: NIST 800-171, NIST 800-53, NIST 800-37, CMMC, and ISO 27001. And again, these are tailored assessments, so very fitted to a given client, their requirements, and some of their cyber needs. All of these assessments we're presently doing right now are all designed and geared towards the delivery of system security plans, various POAM requirements or plan of action milestones, and any self-attestation requirements that may be facing organizations. And again, this is an opportunity for us to work with client organizations to help them fill some of these requirements. In terms of the expertise that we have to offer, and the team that we've assembled. We have over 30 years in audit, specifically DoD, cyber risk and vulnerability assessments, as well as we are presently a CMMC C3PAO candidate, pending and awaiting our final DIBCAC audit, which we hope to have in the next several months, at which time we'll become a full-blown approved CMMC C3PAO in the marketplace. So that is something we continue to work on and await for some direction and timing for in that regard. So Aaron, if you can go to the next slide. So the last thing I'd mention about ISS this afternoon, again, I wanted Aaron to have a majority of the time to go over some of the aerospace specific items he covered, but we do have a upcoming training opportunity involving some of our cyber offerings, cyber services that we offer. We actually have, it's an 8-hour executive cyber training. It's executive cybersecurity implementation training that we're doing at the end of March. And this training is an on-site training. It's actually being supported out at the Ohio Aerospace Institute, which is just outside Cleveland Hopkins Airport. Seats are limited, so I would suggest if this is an engagement that you want to get involved with, that you sign up quickly. The training itself runs 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And actually, as a result of this training, there will be 8 CEUs provided to any participants, as well as, very importantly, an actionable cyber plan of action that they can take from the training to bring back to their organizations, a playbook, as we're referring to it, with implementable actions in terms of various cyber requirements and things that organizations are faced with implementing. So we're looking forward to this being a very interactive training, and certainly one that organizations, through their participation and namely our facilitators' experience and the course materials we've developed, I think every individual participant is going to find a lot of value for this training with each of their various cyber requirements that they have. So we hope to see many of you there. We will be providing this information following the webinar, and certainly in regards to this training or information security services, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Smithers for any further support. And that's it from my end.
So thanks, Aaron. Appreciate both of your time. I'm going to jump back over here real quickly to start up our Q&A session here. So again, just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We do have one question now. I'm going to share my screen again real quick. And let me advance one. So again, on your screen there, right at the bottom, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, we're happy to answer those. We have a little bit of time yet, so please feel free to. We do have one question that came in from Charles. Charles asked, what isn't, I think Charles meant to say, why isn't AS9100 AESQ quality management system requirements for aero engine design and production organizations not included in this webinar? This is supplemental to AS9100 that applies to most, if not all, organizations who are looking at AS9100 certification.
Sure. So my response on that, yeah, sorry, this is Aaron Dalby. My response on that would be, number one, that the focus of this was on the gaps between ISO 9001 and AS9100. And secondly, the AS13100 requirements would be seen as a flow down from one of your customers. And so until you receive the specific contracts, we wouldn't see the specific requirement for meeting AS13100. Aaron Troshanes, did you have anything you want to add to that?
No, not from my end. I think that's the appropriate connection because there's a whole series of supporting, we'll call them system requirements, but they're really flow down. They get down to a very granular level, whereas opposed to 9001, AS9100 is all management system level type requirements.
Thanks, guys. I don't see any other questions that have come in. We can just give a couple. Oh, here's another one. Charles just says, thank you. Thank you, Charles. Appreciate the question. So if anybody else has anything, of course, feel free to type those in. We'll grab them as we move on here. So just as a wrap up, as Aaron mentioned a little bit ago, this presentation will be available on smithers.com shortly. We will have a video up on our website, and we will let everybody know when that's available. In addition, because there were links that were embedded in this presentation, and we realize it's kind of hard to capture those in a Zoom presentation, we will be creating a PDF of this slide deck, and we will send a copy out to everybody who registered. So you'll have it as a reference if you'd like. And again, when we wrap up today, a survey will appear in your browser window. Appreciate you taking 30 seconds to leave us some feedback as we do look at that, and it does help us decide on what topics we bring you in future webinars. One other question from Margaret came in, and hopefully I just answered that one for you, Margaret. She asks if the slides will be available afterwards. Yes, we'll make sure you get a copy, and you're welcome, Margaret. Thank you for the question. So we will get that out to everybody. Give us maybe a day, and we'll have that out to everybody. Then following that, you'll be able to go to the website and watch the video if you want to share it with somebody else. No other questions at this time, it looks like. So we take a quick check of the time. We're a little bit early, but if there's nothing else, thank you both Aaron and Aaron for your time today. It was great information. Certainly appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And we hope you have a great rest of your day and weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.